This week on the Midlife Awareness Podcast.
Let me be very clear. Nobody is neutral. If you're staying home and getting all your groceries delivered and you never go out of your house, you ain't neutral. You've accepted the status quo and you're, of course, just let you know, I'm not judging, I'm just telling you, you're not neutral. You can't be neutral when something like this is going on. If you're doing nothing, you're on the side of the ice and all the rest.
Welcome back to the Midlife Awareness Podcast. Thank you again for joining us today. We have a special treat as we have two special guests with us today. John Dominic Crossing is a returning veteran here on the Midlife Awareness Podcast. Dom, how you doing, buddy?
Doing fine. Nice to be back again with you, Dennis, and especially with Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, we do have Michael Okinzyc-Cruz with us today. This is a first time for Michael. And the podcast that we're going to be doing today and speaking of today is dealing with a lot of special interests that we have going on today, not only in the U.S., but worldwide. So, Michael, could you give us a little bit of a background as to who you are and what you do?
Happy to, Dennis, and it's great to be with you and in the audience. My background is I've served as a faith-based community organizer now for close to 15 years. I've worked in Buffalo, New York, and Niagara Falls, California, and Northern California specifically. And now I'm in the middle of the country, just about here in Chicago and in Illinois. And the work I do, it's really a gift. I get to work with people of all walks of life, people who feel very motivated by their faith, to engage in public life with one another, to work for the common good, to address issues in their communities and neighborhoods related to poverty and violence and inequality, and a concern for creation and the environment, a commitment to standing with one another in solidarity to address the issues that affect their lives. And to do that from a perspective of their faith through methodologies of community organizing is just a joy to see, because you see folks engage meaningfully in public life in ways that produce tangible and concrete improvements for their neighborhoods and their communities. So in addition to this work as a faith-based community organizer, I also teach theology. I'm a theology professor at the Institute of Pastoral Studies at Loyola University of Chicago. And I've been in Chicago now for close to 10 years. And here in Chicago, I work to co-found an organization called the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership. We do grassroots-led, faith-rooted community organizing in a manner that's grounded in the Catholic and Christian spiritual and theological traditions. So really drawing from what we call the liberative traditions of our faith, because we know all theology is not equal. Some theology promotes ideologies of domination and that cast some people as more worthy as others, or our role on this planet is being one in which we're meant to dominate nature rather than live in coexistence with nature. And so when I say liberative, I mean the theological and spiritual traditions that really move us to be in union with one another and with God, and to work to advance God's kingdom on this earth in the here and now. So that's a little bit about myself, and I've had the honor and pleasure of doing some work together with both academically, but also in terms of advancing some of the work that we've done at CSPL more recently, which has been a joy.
Yeah, Dom, I'm going to go run to you next on this one. How did you guys meet up, and how did the collaboration with this book come together?
Well, then Michael invited me to come to their annual convention. He just mentioned the CSPL, excuse me, the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership. I kind of the back of my mind when I hear public, I hear political in the best sense of the word as well. So spiritual and political. He invited me to come to the coalition, to their annual convention and give on 3 nights. I think it was it Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights, three lectures on the historical Jesus. That's what it was. I was going to do the vision of Jesus, the execution of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. And I think we saw immediately that it flowed directly into their organizing because we were talking about Jesus organizing
Hmm.
and what got him killed and what
Right.
happened afterwards. We were talking about something, at least in the first century, that was absolutely and fiercely political, spiritual, and down to earth. So the discussion started. Then Michael's idea, it was Michael's idea, why don't we write this into a book together? And we wrote that book together. My section was the part that we had given, but it's really our common book. It really is. And I loved it, quite frankly.
Yes, I really enjoyed the book too. I think, Dom, it seems like you have a knack for hitting the most crucial and in time events. And it wasn't long after you guys gave me this book that I mean, obviously the news was filled with ICE detentions and things like that. But it wasn't
Yeah,
long after you gave me the book is when then we went on to war with Iran.
exactly.
And
Exactly.
so I don't know, it just seems like you have a knack for um, um, looking forward to events like this. And it is every time I talk to you, it is really interesting on how it just seems like the United States, if we haven't already, we're getting closer and closer and closer to what it looked like to the Roman Empire in the first century.
Honestly, Dennis, if that's true, I'm going to give the credit to Jesus because I'm always working. I don't mean that piously,
Yeah,
honestly.
right.
I'm
Yeah.
always working with the historical Jesus. He claims to be speaking to the ages. Okay, this is 2026.
Yeah.
What's he got to say today? If he's not, then he's not speaking to the ages. So I'm always looking for that point of view. What does Jesus say to now? And I'm quite ready to say, well, he says nothing to us now.
Yeah.
He's done his job and
Yeah.
I can't get to that point.
Yeah. So before we begin, I want to name the tension that's in the room because if you are listening to this, you don't need to be told that something is broken. You feel it in the world. It's in the news. It's in your body. Anger makes sense here. Grief makes sense here, but so does exhaustion. And still something feels unsettled. Like furniture moved in a familiar room, like scripture you thought you understood has started asking questions back. That tension has a name, and that tension is called a house divided. A faith divided between love and fear cannot stand. A theology divided between justice and mercy cannot stand. A soul divided between obedience and honesty cannot stand. And a church divided by who is saved and who is damned cannot stand. Jesus and justice were never meant to be separated, but we've learned how to split them, how to make faith safe and justice optional. Belief became private, harm stayed systematic, and the gospel slowed, shrank until it fit neatly inside of us, never touching the structures that actually wound people. So let's be clear at the start. Jesus didn't die because he was kind. He died because he organized hope. Rome didn't crucify people to solve spiritual problems, it crucified them to stop movements, which means the cross isn't a symbol to admire or an identity form. It's a warning. And resurrection isn't an escape plan, it's a refusal to let violence have the final word. That leaves us with a question that we cannot avoid. Does the gospel end with us? Or does it work through us? Because a faith that ends at personal belief cannot live comfortably in a divided house. But a faith that works through us will always threaten the walls. Neutrality won't hold. Silence won't save us. In a tilted system, standing still always sides with power. But Jesus never did. And prayer, real prayer, was never passive. Prayer was alignment. Prayer was readiness. Prayer was a moment Isaiah said, "Here am I, Lord, send me," and then actually went. So this isn't an episode about abstract theology. It's about what happens when faith becomes public, when love becomes the sanctuary, and when belief grows legs. The house is still divided, but the invitation is still open. Now, those are kind of my thoughts when we get started on down this road. Again, your book was very eye-opening. We're going to go through the ins and outs of the book now, and basically, where I wanted to start with was at the beginning, Dom. I'm going to start with you. Something was wrong, right? In the world that Jesus walked into, um, if you ever driven down a highway, I don't know if you guys have ever done this and have seen on any of the cars or vehicles a little fish symbol people have all over the place. Sometimes it's a chrome, sometimes it has the name of Jesus in it, but it's meant to say that I'm a Christian. It's a form of identity. But that symbol didn't begin as a bumper sticker. It tells Peter and Andrew in Mark 1:17 that he will make us fishers of people. In Mark 6 and in Mark 8, Jesus has parables about feeding the multitudes of fish. Countless other passages in Scripture talk about casting nets. When you place him in the first century Roman Palestine, what was off? What was so broken that Jesus needed a movement to even exist?
Okay, you've touched on it already. Think of that metaphor, fishers of men. That's not a very nice metaphor. Like a hook in your mouth. It's not. Why did he pick on fishers? Elijah, for example, went looking for Elisha to be his cohort, as it were. Where did he go? To a farm looking for somebody behind the plow. That's the ancient tradition. Cincinnatus in the Romans, where do you find a good man plowing on the farm? Maybe even our President Garfield. He went to the lake for fishers. Now, anyone who is thinking, and that's always the danger when you're reading the Bible,
Yeah.
would ask, why fishers? And that's the clue almost to the whole start of Jesus. Because by the year 20, keep it very simple, his governor, who's good old Herod Antipas, has decided to move his capital city from inland Sepphoris, lovely site, by the way, up on a mound, to lakeshore Tiberias, called after the emperor Tiberius. So, come on, that's a question. Who moves their capital? You want to really, really, really get your people annoyed. Try moving your capital. Because how do you sell a used villa? Or the people who come in from the farm and sell their little things. Why did he move his capital? And here again, the fish is everywhere. What is going on, and this is what gives Jesus traction and gets his movement going. And why the fishermen say, yes, we're with you. Because he's out to commercialize the lake, close it down, make it not a commons as we say, usually think of that as land, but an enclosure. So no, I can't go down in the evening and toss out a net for some protein additives for my family. Ah, everything is changing. That's where the tradition gets traction. And without traction, your tradition circulates lovely in the air.
And Michael, when you hear the historical setup, what feels familiar to this story? Like, where do you see the dynamic showing up now?
Well, I think there are a lot of parallels that we could draw from this. One example that we referred to at the beginning of this chapter, chapter one, was we drew from a quote from Sitting Bull.
Mhm.
And, thinking about the Native American and indigenous struggle against Western expansion, I think in American colonialism, is there are a lot of parallels that we could draw in terms of a growing empire, seizing land, seizing natural resources with the intention of economically extracting every ounce that they could squeeze out of the natural abundance that the Native American people and the various tribes and cultures relied upon and had in many ways a reciprocal and sacred relationship to. And so thinking about the Sea of Galilee, which became like Lake Tiberias, there was a relationship that these first century people had to the lake. It produced for them in ways that sustained their lives. sustainably. And then in comes the Roman Empire and Herod Antipas to really extract as much as they could possibly from this lake. And so you see the dramatic commercialization of it. So we've seen similar things take place in the United States in terms of the seizure of lands and resources. That's certainly something that we could look at and examine in a parallel way when we think about westward expansion and colonialism in this country. I also think about it in a more contemporary sense. You know, here in Chicago, but all across the country, we see these gigantic, really ugly Amazon factories, which are huge.
Mhm.
And oftentimes, what these corporations like Amazon or Walmart are looking for is land, an abundance of land. They strike a deal with a government body or a private landowner. They purchase that land. They put a huge square box right in the middle of a community. And oftentimes, they're looking for a very vulnerable population to exploit and to draw that population into their monopoly. And, Walmart, Amazon, these are extraordinarily monopolistic companies. They are ruthless. And so think about, first century fishermen. They'd have no choice but to produce in ways that were governed by and dictated by the local hierarchy. And Herod Antipas and the Roman Empire. Just like here in our economy today, if you're a poor working class person in a neighborhood where Amazon's plopped a massive factory in your backyard or a Walmart, it becomes the epicenter of economic activity
Mhm.
in a way that's extraordinarily extractive and marginalizing and dominating. And we see this more and more in our country.
While reading this book, here's something that I keep running into myself and also in the church. Um, Dom, we've talked about this before, but Jesus could have kept this safer. He could have been focused on the interchange, personal holiness, no meals that blurred the lines, no overturning the tables, no organizing. But Dom, what gets lost when justice gets stripped out of the gospel?
Well, justice gets lost, to put it very bluntly, and so does the gospel. Gospel is good news.
Mhm.
Okay, there's no such thing as abstract good news. If I want to go out boating, it's good news. It's a good day. If somebody else wants something, good news for whom is the question. Now it's quite clear in the New Testament. It really is. It says it's good news for the oppressed. It says it's good news for the poor. I mean, it says it. You're quite free to say I think it's rubbish, but you're not free to say it doesn't say it,
Hmm.
as Washington is doing right now. That's
Right.
what it says. By all means, if you want to say Christianity is wrong, we are the Antichrist, then that's honest. But admit what you're doing. It's good news. Rome, by the way, also claimed good news, and good news primarily, by the way, it was always plural in Rome. We can't do good news as is in English, but in Greek you can have plural good news, euangelioi. So good news was the announcement of an imperial victory. Public. That was their idea of good news. We've won. Okay. Now you have the good news, and the good news is Jesus
Mhm.
himself, the person, not about him or anything else. There's the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, but that's according to. There's only one gospel. There's not four or five or whatever. That's Jesus. So that's good news. Now, that's physical. It's not just spiritual. It could have been, by the way, if Jesus had not been a Jew and wasn't coming stalking out of the Old Testament, which has been saying this for 2,000 years. So it could have been, you can imagine a totally spiritual, interior. You just went into meditation and it's all about me and you and all of us individually. It could have been. But then it wouldn't have been Jewish and he wouldn't have been a Jew. And of course, it wouldn't have been Christianity either. So it was, in one sense, funneled through its Judaisness towards the world. And I would simply say to every Christian who might be listening, what you have in John is God so loved the world. And if he loved the world, God must love everyone in it. But it's very different from saying God loves you and me and this person and all of us kind of individually. And yeah, we kind of get together, but it's all individual. No, it's the world. How do you get away from that? Well, you
Yeah.
do by becoming anti-Christian. Simple.
Now, Michael, in the organizational space here, what happens when faith talks about compassion but avoids the structure power of systems?
It's a great question, Dennis. I'm paraphrasing here. Dr. King many years ago uh, mentioned that love without power is mere sentimentality. And so when we talk about love, compassion, mercy without any recognition of the importance of power in advancing systemic, structural, social change at a deeper, more transformational level, we are talking in sentimental terms. We need to talk about power, and this is what we talk a lot about in the work I'm engaged in. We need to build power in order to protect the things that we value most. If we value children, if we value equality, if we value equal opportunity, if we value a person's inherent dignity, we are talking about power and structures and systems of power that can either affirm a person's inherent dignity and worth or that can denigrate and diminish a person's inherent dignity and worth. So there's a lot of talk about compassion and mercy in faith communities. There's often far less talk about power and love as two elements that have to go hand in hand if we're going to seriously address the inequalities and the conditions in our society that produce violence and death and despair for so many. And so I would say, while we need to welcome conversations in faith communities that that speak to the importance of compassion and love and mercy, to do so without a recognition of power and how power and relationships and systems go hand in hand, to either promote or deny dignity and human flourishing. Those conversations are merely sentimental and lack the the essential thrust and underlying understanding of what it's going to take to produce communities that will allow for human flourishing in the long run. But this is all too common, and understandably so. It is much more uncomfortable to engage in conversations, both within faith communities and through faith communities into the public arena that challenge the existing social, political, and economic arrangements. Because just talking about mercy and compassion in ways that are completely devoid of any political, sociological, economic analysis, well, those are nice conversations coming from nice people who want to do nice things. But niceness is not the response we need. We need courage. We need directness. We need forthrightness. We need to be bold. We need to be prophetic, just like Jesus. And so the real conversation, which needs to be driven by faith communities, which is an analysis of what structures and systems and ideologies promote and uphold hatred and sexism and violence and economic equality and the powers that be that uphold these structures, that is a much more difficult conversation to have because it automatically generates a counter reaction and a significant pushback. And this is what Jesus's movement endured because of the questions it asked and because of the contrasting vision of the reign of Caesar Augustus and the Roman Empire and Jesus's, kingdom of God movement, reign of God movement, which was a counter movement that directly challenged Roman imperial rule. Again, we don't have a public execution of Jesus if he was just a nice guy talking
Mhm.
about compassion and love.
Right.
We That's a very different story about how his life ends if that was the case. And that's been the case for many revolutionaries who challenged the status quo. Dr. King and others who really gave their lives because of the deeper, more profound questions around power and mercy and justice that they were asking.
One of the things that your book does, and I really appreciated this outlook, was it doesn't let Jesus off the hook as just a good teacher. Um, both of you were pretty clear that this movement was organized, and Jesus was the leader of it. Michael, when you say organizing in today's structure, what does that mean practically?
Organizing today is quite challenging, in part because one of the founders of the modern day faith-based organizing movement, Saul Alinsky, who began much of his work in Chicago, during that time, power was concentrated much more locally. So if a local community, let's say one of the neighborhoods where Saul Alinsky worked was in back of the yards, and you had a factory that was exploiting workers, more often than not, you could organize those workers. They could get together and they could march over to the owner's home. In all likelihood, the owner lived in Chicago, not too far, and he had a name and he had a face and he had an address. And so the proximity to power was much closer.
Mm.
Today, let's say workers who are working in an Amazon factory and are being overwhelmingly oppressed and marginalized to the point where even going to the bathroom and taking a break to relieve themselves puts them at risk for punishment because of the overwhelming demands on their time. Who do they hold accountable?
Right.
You have this massive global corporation where their power is so minuscule compared to the power of this multinational corporation. And so the challenge is around building grassroots power or the power of workers through unions, and then holding these owners or corporations or companies accountable. It's a vastly different world that we live in today. And so, one, we have to take that into account. This is a much more challenging time and era that we live in because the fundamental question of accountability, which it's a fundamental matter in society, there has to be levers of accountability. And the problem today is that so many people in power with extraordinary levels of power are unaccountable. They are above accountability for the majority of us in this country. Um, One example of that is the Epstein files. In Europe, people who've been caught up in the Epstein files, many of them have lost their positions in power or being prosecuted
Hmm.
for their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. There's been no accountability for anybody practically who's been entangled in the Jeffrey Epstein files here in the United States.
Wow.
So part of it is cultural. I think what we try to do in organizing today within faith communities is to, one, gather and grow a coalition that is broad-based, that is diverse, that is a combination of different racial and ethnic groups. So to really build a multiracial, multi-class, multi-generational coalition is incredibly important. We can't be segmented and expect to have enough power to affect positive change in the public arena. We've got to build a multiracial, multi-generational, and multi-ethnic and multi-class coalition if we're going to really address the fundamental questions that we as a people need to address to improve our, the state of affairs, both locally and nationally. So we begin with a lot of relationship building and listening, because that's how you foster an understanding of the things that bind us together as a people. The things that matter to you and to me and to Dom also matter to, somebody living in an immigrant community, or somebody living in the suburbs. It's about putting a roof over our head, paying our bills, covering medical expenses, figuring out how to, find work that is meaningful and that pays a decent wage, or sending our children to college, which is extraordinarily difficult today given the cost of education. All these questions matter to the majority of us, and the more we listen and the more we build relationships, the more we find that we have more and more that binds us together.
And your coalition that we talked about, it's a coalition of, I'm going to guess, maybe about 50 to 60 organizations, not
Yes,
just the people, but
yes,
of parishes, of universities.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a coalition of organizations.
yeah.
And Dom, going back to historical speaking, then back in Jesus's day, the meals, the healings, community, these weren't just kind gestures, were they?
No, I mean, it kind of makes me want to scream, to be honest with you. The Romans didn't crucify you. They didn't waste Roman nails and an execution squad of trained executioners on people who simply annoyed them. If Jesus was a nice guy going around patting little babies, telling little stories, and telling people we should love one another, Rome would have given him a medal and sent him home to Galilee with a pension, maybe. They would have loved that. You get canonized for charity, you get crucified for justice. So if all we had of Jesus, we didn't have any of the Christian stuff, we just had Josephus, and we read him carefully. We know this guy, whoever he is, this Jesus called the Christ, he got executed, but his guys weren't rounded up. Ah, so he wasn't violent then. Rome, when against violent movements, you grab them all and crucify them in a row so people get the idea. When you crucify the leader only, Rome is telling you we consider him a major nuisance. He is disturbing the peace. He is disturbing the people. That's exactly what he is. We would call it demonstrating. He's what we would call an activist. He is not violent, or there would have been at least 12 crosses up there. So we learn a huge amount from the history about Jesus that I consider very important.
And to piggyback off of that, obviously once these big movements get going, power notices, um, justice becomes embodied. What would, Dom, this is for you, leading up to and during that last week of Jesus, how would Rome understood what Jesus was doing?
Oh, I think quite well. What we have to understand is why Jesus wasn't dead by the evening of what we call Palm Sunday. He's already done one demonstration, mocking actually, laughing at Pilate. If you imagine him bringing up 600 extra troops for the Passover, which is deadly dangerous. These people are celebrating freedom from Egypt when they're clearly under Rome. So
Right.
what's to celebrate? Dangerous time. So more troops come up from the west. In comes Jesus from the east on a donkey. That's almost like a Saturday Night Live. Lampoon, very dangerous. Why isn't he dead by Sunday night? Now, when in doubt, read the text. Mark makes it quite clear he has a huge defensive screen. Every day in the temple, the authorities want to move, but they're afraid of the crowd because it could provoke a riot, which is the worst thing. They'd rather let Jesus do whatever he wants to do and get home to Galilee, which is what they say in Mark 14:1. He got away with it. We give up. We give up. Let him go home and we won't risk a riot. But then to figure out how to get him at night. That's what they have to do. Every day he's in the temple to find it, sorry, defended by his screen. But every night, he's smart, he gets out of it. He's not trying to get himself killed, by the way.
Yeah.
It's real easy. He gets out and goes to Bethany, about 2 miles away. Don't stay overnight in the city. People disappear. So he almost gets away with it until Caiaphas figures out where to get him halfway. We call Gethsemane. He's out of the temple. He's not to Bethany. That's where you get him in the darkness and get it over fast. So Jesus does not go up to Jerusalem to get himself killed. He could have. He could have. A person could go up and say, I'll go to give my life and I'll become a martyr and it'll inspire. Well, that's not what he's doing. It doesn't take you a week to get yourself killed during Passover, because Passover is zero toleration for a loud cough.
Yeah.
It's dangerous. And you can see why. Huge group of people in the temple celebrating freedom from Egypt. And look up at to the northwest and look at the soldiers marching backwards and forwards on the Fortress Antonio, looking at them, maybe even mocking them as they do later in the 50s. So the real question is, why isn't Jesus dead by our counting? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Okay. He doesn't go up to get himself killed. He goes up to make a double demonstration against Roman imperial control and high priestly collaboration with it. And he almost gets away with it.
Michael, in today's world, what does resistance look like when people start organizing around dignity and shared power?
Well, I think this is very relevant in this moment. The example I think I'll use to uh, reflect on this question will be the response, the courageous response of thousands of people to ICE raids in cities across the country. Right now, predominantly, the most acute and painful operations have been conducted in democratically run cities. So Chicago, Minnesota, or Minneapolis, Los Angeles. I'll use Chicago and Minnesota as two critical examples. In Minnesota, you had 3,000 ICE and Border Patrol agents deployed. It's a horrific scene. To our knowledge, ICE agents are still actively deployed in very high numbers across Minnesota, across Minneapolis, and the Twin Cities. It's just not being covered and reported on as thoroughly as it was at the height of that operation several weeks ago. But you had residents of Minneapolis turn out in mass, neighbors protecting neighbors, faith communities coming out on the streets to sing and to pray. The development of these grassroots networks that were seeking to provide food and money and resources to immigrant families that were in desperate need because breadwinners could not go out and work for fear of being detained and deported or being racially profiled, which is happening in mass across the country for fear of being racially profiled and detained. Um, you had residents pulling together and supporting one another and supporting their immigrant neighbors in ways that were beautiful and powerful and transformative. At the same time, you had people putting their lives at risk. We have Alex Preddy being what I felt executed
Mm.
on camera. This was a nurse who was simply trying to defend a young woman who had been pushed down by an agent and then is confronted by Border Patrol agents and he's taken to the ground, is clearly secured by the number of agents around him, and then is horrifically shot in the back multiple times. So people are putting their lives on the line. Renee Good, a mother, shot in the face and publicly executed just in horrific fashion. So an example that we see of massive amounts of people coming out to protect and to demonstrate their love for their neighbors across Minnesota. In Chicago, where I live and where I work with the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership, this coalition of 60 institutional members, as Dom mentioned, and I'm grateful, Dom, you did mention that just to offer a bit more specificity of churches, universities, religious orders, community organizations working together from across the city, in the suburbs, in the
Yeah.
state. We've really done a lot to challenge the very inhumane conditions within ICE and DHS detention facilities. Here outside of Chicago, we have what's called the Broadview ICE Processing Center. It's meant to be a center that immigrants are only held at for a few hours at a time, but during the height of Operation Midway Blitz, immigrants were being held there for 5, 6, 7 days at a time, nowhere to sleep, rooms that were nowhere near large enough to hold 100, 150 people. You had 100, 150 immigrants crammed in a single room for days at a time. People were sleeping on floors. There's one toilet in this room, so you had feces on the ground. After days and days of enduring these conditions without contact with their family or an attorney, they're meeting with DHS attorneys who are coercing them to sign away their legal rights to be represented. One judge called this akin to a concentration camp. The conditions were so inhumane. So during that time, over the last several months, we've been able to mobilize the organization I work with, CSPL, over 8,000 people over the course of 4 months to engage in public actions to challenge the conditions, but also to challenge the lack of pastoral access for ministers. Ministers have been able to, in the past, access these ICE and DHS facilities to provide pastoral care for immigrants, to accompany them, to pray with them, to offer in the Catholic tradition the sacraments, communion. That those doors have been locked. Not even priests and women religious like sisters or ministers have been able to get in to even pray with immigrant detainees, which is a violation of not only the
Sure.
religious rights of detainees,
Mhm.
but the religious right of ministers as well. And so we've been moving thousands of people to nonviolently, but courageously challenge the practice and the denial of the religious rights of immigrant detainees, as well as the religious rights of ministers, but in a more broader sense, to challenge this whole system that is so dehumanizing and authoritarian. And so I think organizing is essential in this moment because Americans, regardless of their political affiliation, I think need to be alarmed by what is increasingly being called an authoritarian movement to diminish the rights of everyday Americans. And we see unfolding in these cities and states is a very clearly laid out plan to scapegoat immigrants, many of whom are just simply trying desperately to live a decent life in this country, but scapegoating immigrants for the economic precarity that so many in our country endure.
Mhm.
I hate to burst people's bubble, but it's not the fault of a Venezuelan woman that people in Kentucky have been economically disenfranchised. The fault lies with corporations and politicians who've sold out working people in this country. And so we are scapegoating immigrants for vast forms of economic exploitation that corporations and extraordinarily powerful politicians and business leaders have caused. And so we have to resist not only what's happening right in front of us, but we also have to assess and analyze the roots of the struggle that we're engaged in. Why is it that we have these vast immigration raids occurring. And a lot of it is it's an extraordinarily effective distraction from the ways in which oligarchic powers are continuing to strip workers and everyday people of their economic and political rights.
A gentle pushback or question here, and I'll take a quick answer from both of you on this, but is neutrality actually possible in these situations? I mean, obviously, Don, we talk about the overturning of the tables is what Jesus did, but we also talk about his nonviolence resistance. Um, One of the unfortunate things that happens from time to time here is the rioting that can go on.
Yeah.
So, Martin Luther King Jr. always talked about at some point there comes a pushing point for people. Um, is neutrality, is it even possible if you're dealing with these systems of oppression?
Let me be very clear. Nobody is neutral. If you're staying home and getting all your groceries delivered and you never go out of your house, you ain't neutral. You've accepted the status quo and you're you. Of course, just let you know, I'm not judging, I'm just telling you, you're not neutral. You
Mhm.
can't be neutral when something like this is going on. If you're doing nothing, you're on the side of the ice and all the rest of it. Let me be very clear. I want to go into that demonstration of Jesus because I get that again and again. I'm going to say to people, please read the text.
Yeah,
What Jesus is doing is closing down business in the temple.
right.
When he turns over the table, does that close down the temple? No. What it really does is just inconvenience the bankers who are perfectly legitimate in there to change money from people coming all over the Roman world to see this magnificent temple, and like we would do in a situation, want to make a donation. So they're changing. They're not thieving or anything like that. To make it a den of thieves does not mean that's not where thieves thieve. In a den of thieves is a safe house. It's a hideaway. So this is quoting Jeremiah, actually quoting Jeremiah, where God says, if you're out there committing injustice, don't think you can get to my temple and say, we made it, we're safe. You have turned my temple into a den, a hideaway for thieves. Now, what Jesus does, by the way, and only in John's gospel, when he uses the script of chords, he's driving out the animals. Read it. It's quite clear. He's not doing it to people. How do you make the animals run if you could? I don't know how you even do it. But that's how you do it with a whip of cords. It's not, it's a demonstration. But demonstrations are on the cusp, as Rome knew, between violence and nonviolence. They are dangerous. Of course they were. If you go into a draft how, a room and turn over the files, somebody might think you're a robber and shoot you. Of course. A demonstration is even at its best of times, and we are not at the best of times.
Right.
Dangerous. Somebody could get a riot or something. A riot in the temple during Passover, thousands would have been crushed. Forget the soldiers. People rushing to the southern gates would have been crushed alive. So dangerous, of course, but a demonstration, no matter how dangerous, is different from an armed attack of any type. And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with demonstrations against the temple's cooperation or against Roman authority. It's not funny stuff.
Mm.
It's very dangerous. The, the strange thing that requires explanation is why Jesus isn't dead, as I said, then by Monday night. That's the night after the second demonstration. You have to explain, if you're a historian, how come he's getting away with it? That's what has to be explained.
If we look at today's world again, the cross isn't just a religious symbol anymore. Um, we embody it. It becomes part of who we are. Um, I'm going to throw out some eye-popping numbers for you guys here that I found anyway. The global spiritual jewelry market is worth roughly 15 to 16 billion dollars annually. and soon to exceed over 20 billion. Now that's worldwide. The broader religious spiritual products market, um, think gifts and home decor and stuff like that, is around 5.5 billion. Just in North America alone, religious projects products generate over $4 billion in annual sales. The cross has become something that we embody. We see crosses on necklaces, tattoos, bracelets. It's everywhere. So you're looking at a multi-million dollar, multi-billion dollar, I'm sorry, faith industry, which creates a striking irony. The cross began as Rome's symbol of humiliation and terror.
Mm-hmm.
Today, it's one of the most profitable religious symbols on the earth. Okay, but historically, the crucifixion was a warning. So, Dom, what does the cross tell us about how empire responds to justice movements?
Okay, I go to quote Paul in First Corinthians. What struck Paul and amazed him was here's the way he asked the question. God knew from all eternity that when Jesus, the Messiah, Christ, finally came, they'd crucify him. And Rome, with its vaunted justice and peace and law and order and civilization, would do it. Ah, said Paul. And then he finally saw it. What God was doing was showing the hollow, savage heart of Roman perfection, if you will. This is what civilization looks like. It crucifies a Messiah who comes non-violently. That's what Paul's great revelation, and I'm using revelation not in a pious sense, but in the sense of what Michael was saying. You look at what happens in Minneapolis, and you get a revelation of the savage heart behind it. Oh, it was there all the time. It wasn't invented in the streets of Minneapolis. You just saw it. That's a revelation. And Paul said, so Rome, the peace of the Pax Romana, is a hollow core of savagery, surrounded by savagery, as it were, protected by savagery. That's Paul's revelation. And to turn that into some kind of an ornament is horrible.
Yeah.
It blows my mind what type of co-optation is going on, because usually authority will co-opt signs that say, we'll build you a church, don't worry about it, we'll build you a church. But why you want to wear that as a symbol? Now, if it's a confession of faith, that's something else, but it doesn't have to be gold to be a confession of faith. So I would really ask people, think what you're doing, please. Think
And
what
what,
you're doing.
Michael, in your experience, how are movements still crucified today? Not basically literally, obviously, but socially, economically, maybe even rhetorically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Just to go back to our prior discussion about these massive ICE operations being conducted across the United States, our president, federal actors in the Department of Homeland Security, they've framed this struggle as a struggle against, anarchist and radical leftist.
Yeah.
And, Alex Preddy was framed as somebody who was ready to commit mass murder by Greg Bovino from CBP, from Border Patrol. You had a reaction on the right to some of the folks that were out protesting, many of whom are mothers, just everyday people, residents who are trying to stand up for the dignity and the worth of their immigrant neighbors. And they're being castigated as radical leftists and as violent interrupters and agitators, as a means of justifying the use of force against them, as in the
Mhm.
case of Renee Good, a mother who was out trying to protect her neighborhood and community and to warn local residents of the presence of ICE and CBP. And she ends up being shot in the face. And rhetoric especially violent, heightened rhetoric that is painting the opposition as the enemy, which our president has done repeatedly, and his administration has done. It sends a signal to ICE agents and Border Patrol agents that the American public who's engaged in resisting their aggressive tactics and the invasion of their cities and neighborhoods, it convinces these agents that the American public itself is the enemy
Mhm.
and that use of force against the enemy is justifiable on this crusade in this mission. So not only do we have people who are trying to stand up nonviolently for justice and mercy and compassion being rhetorically demonized and in some cases killed by by federal officials, we also see immigrants bearing the brunt of this wave of xenophobia and hatred. I work with many of these families who've come here. Many of the Central American families that I work with in Chicago and that I worship with at my church, many of them arrived in the United States having just crossed the Darien Gap out of desperation and out of an eagerness to achieve some semblance of normalcy in their lives. And they arrive just across the border and they're shipped by Governor Greg Abbott to Chicago and New York City, many times not knowing where they had just ended up after several days on a bus.
Mhm.
And it's many of these same families that are now being targeted and detained and deported despite having work permits to work here, having legal authorized work permits. And so in some cases, I know parents who've been separated. In one case, a mother was sent to a detention center in Kentucky for almost 3 months. The father was sent to a detention center in Indiana. Neither had any contact with one another. They're separated from their children who are still in the country, and now both adults are back in Venezuela. And they were just simply here to achieve a decent, meaningful life for themselves and did not choose to come to Chicago, certainly chose to come to the United States. But I don't know any reasonable person who decides to leave everything they know and to walk thousands of miles, including through the Darien Gap, unless extraordinarily difficult circumstances force them to make that decision. And just like we saw in Jesus's time, people forced into dehumanizing conditions and forced into making extraordinarily difficult decisions because of the powers that be, playing games, dictating at this very high political level, the kind of decisions that have reverberating repercussions for ordinary people. When the powerful unite and make these decisions absent any concern whatsoever for ordinary people, it often creates havoc for ordinary people. And this was one of the things that we talked about when examining the decision that went into replacing Herod the Great. You had Caesar making this decision with no concern whatsoever about the people in Judea.
Mhm.
It was just simply a decision based on calculus as far as what was good, what was in the interest of the Roman Empire, economically, politically, militarily. Caesar did not have any concern about, women and children and workers.
Right.
It was just how do we suppress these people and get as much out of them as we can, and who's going to do the best job at that? And so the same absence of any level of empathy and concern or regard for ordinary people in South America, Central America, Mexico, and the economic and political decisions that radically disrupt our lives, these kind of decisions are being made daily and forcing people to flee their native countries and to walk thousands of miles in search of opportunity. And what's aggravating all of this is the rapid destabilization of our environments, which are really affecting southern nations because, the agriculture patterns, agricultural patterns that provided reliable income, that's all in upheaval now
Mm.
because of Western countries, which are largely to blame for vast amounts of carbon pollution. And so all of these people, which I consider crucified peoples of today, are fleeing. And now we have people in Iran fleeing,
Yeah.
Lebanon fleeing, and there's chaos throughout the Middle East all over again. And you have, decisions being made by Trump, by Netanyahu, with no regard for the millions of people whose lives are being vastly disrupted by these decisions. And that also includes the Iranian regime. I mean, these powerful actors are not friendly people either. I
Right.
think they're not thinking about the lives of women and children and orphans and elderly. They're making decisions based on their own political calculus and seeking to remain in power. So these same patterns of the powerful colluding to advance their interest to the detriment of ordinary people is still pervasive. And in our case today, we see these movements, not only in terms of social justice struggles, but these migration movements of crucified people over and over and over again. And they continue to be crucified, um, metaphorically, symbolically speaking, through deportation, through detention, through killings, through family separation. It's just horrific, the suffering that people have to endure in our world today that is so unnecessary.
One of the things that I did really enjoy about the book and about both of you and your work was that resurrection isn't treated like an escape hatch. It's whether or not something actually continues. So, Dom, historically speaking, what does resurrection mean if we don't reduce it to myth or magic?
Okay, let me ask our whole audience. Let's on you've never heard the word resurrection before. And also, let's on you've never heard the word ascension before. Now you're in the first century. Everyone accepts across the Mediterranean, uh, Greeks, Romans, and Jews, that certain individuals who have done something of extraordinary benefit for the human race, like Aesculapius inventing healing, could be taken up to God or the gods at death. That's taken as the wallpaper of the Mediterranean. So Romulus is taken up because he founded Rome, and Moses is taken up because he founded Judaism. Fine. That's the now 160 years before the time of Jesus, a group I'm going to call them the proto-Pharisees come up with a wild idea. At the end of time, there's going to be a resurrection of the entire human race, bodily, physically, and there's going to be a giant cosmic review by God of the whole human race. And then they're going to be judged for what they have done, and then they're going to heaven or hell. Okay, clear enough. Now, I'm talking for myself now. I don't know if everyone took that literally. I think the people who invented it in the year 160 BCE must have known they had just invented it. But I hear in that term, that's what resurrection meant. It's not ascension. It's not another word for ascension. I hear it as a mighty, powerful parable of the responsibility of the human race for the world, the whole human race, and physically, because what we do in justice is physical. Now, when I hear it today, and I'm asking myself, what does that mean today? I, I'm talking personally for the moment. I don't believe it for a second it's going to happen. I
Yeah.
know how to mock it. Do cannibals, what'll they? But I hear it as a frightening parable of the responsibility of the human race and the modern question of are we a sustainable species? Granted our trajectory of what we are doing, continue to doing, and everything that Michael has been talking about, which is escalating. So I see resurrection as a challenge because Paul says resurrection began with Jesus. Now, wait a minute. The end of time began with Jesus? What, in plain language, what does that mean even? Before I disbelieve it, what does it mean? That the justification of the world began with Jesus. If you don't see what we did to Jesus as the beginning of this great parable, then you miss the whole thing.
Mm.
So claiming resurrection for Jesus, which anyone in the first century would say, well, you can't have a resurrection of an individual. That's an ascension. Resurrection is of the human race. And Paul says, yeah, but it's begun. That means that the judgment of the human race is ongoing right now. Wow, that sounds right to me as I watch the evening news. Heaven and hell are not options in the future, but already open for business. Oh, wow, that sounds right to me too. So, this whole great end time vision of the Pharisees is already operational. That's what Paul says.
Mm.
You can read it in Romans. It's the first fruits of the resurrection considered as the harvest of the world. I find that powerfully, alarmingly, terribly true right now. Not, I'm not speaking as a prophet, I'm speaking of a trajectory. I'm watching what we've been doing. I'm watching the escalation. I know we've never invented a weapon we didn't use. I know we never invent weapons that are worse than the ones before, more powerful, I mean. So I would ask us calmly, not apocalyptically at all, are we a sustainable species? Nobody threatens us with us, of course. I'm not worried about meteors, I really. That's about a 1%. But I would say it's a 99% that with the help of AI, we will probably escalate and move up the sustainability crisis. So I see that. I can't not see it when I read Paul. And if somebody says, well, is it really literal in there? It's quite likely that some people are taking it literally, and that's kind of makes the whole thing silly. But what if it's a parable?
Mhm.
And that's the way I'm seeing it, as a parable of the sustainabilities of our species. That's what resurrection from the first century, hearing it 2,000 years later, means for me.
And Michael, in organizational spaces, what does resurrection on the ground look like?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Dennis. There's a way in which when Dom and I wrote this chapter, it was probably the hardest chapter to write on the resurrection. I think thinking about the resurrection, overcoming death is symbolic for the Roman Empire, which is, produced death in mass. I don't mean just physical death
Yeah.
through violence, but through hunger, poverty, exploitation, domination, ways that we can understand death as a powerful force. I've worked in communities, driven through communities, accompanied people in communities that it just feels like they are surrounded by death. The blight, disinvestment, poverty, hunger, hopelessness is so pervasive in certain communities and neighborhoods, segregation, economic collapse, the collapse of any sense of neighborliness and social cohesion, all of which has been carried out by very powerful actors and very decisive choices that have been made to reshape political and economic circumstances. And so, organizing at the grassroots level is a remarkable way to invite people to discern together what is it that they seek to change, sometimes in very practical ways, sometimes in very transformative, bold, and courageous ways about their community. And so we look at death in this chapter as something that is incredibly symbolic for decisions that are made in the public arena that affect people's lives, that produce hunger and poverty and hopelessness. And so, counter to that is believing that resurrection is possible in a neighborhood, in a community, by organizing to advocate for economic equality, for good jobs, for a hospital system that works and that serves the people and that doesn't just simply exist to generate vast profits, but to actually keep people healthy and to nurture wellness, to work to eradicate pollution and polluters that pollute lakes and bodies of water and land. This is what resurrection can also mean, that a community can go from a community that's rendered powerless and voiceless to a community that is organized and that is working for the common good and working to change the factors and forces that have pillaged them for so long and that have um, rendered their dignity less than. This is what resurrection also means in a modern day sense as well. From our perspective, that resurrection is happening and can happen when we take seriously our call to be co-protagonist, in God's unfolding reign, that this reign of God movement is still happening, but we have to accept responsibility for our role in it. It's not that it just happened then 2000 years ago and the reign of God movement is all, it's done and it's packaged up and it's not happening again. This movement is still very much happening if we choose to follow Jesus's path and engage in this difficult work.
One last segment here. Um, if someone is listening today and takes this book seriously, not just agrees with it, because it's obviously got some really good points in there. Everyone should at least agree with it as they read it. But let's say they get they start to think, okay, I need to do something now. So kind of lightning style here. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and both of you can answer quickly. Um, what has to change in the church from here on out, do you think? Let's start with Dom.
Oh, it has to realize that it has been co-opted. That was what Constantine did. He said, in effect, I'm going to join you. Where can I build your basilica? That's co-optation. And basically the deal was, okay, you take care of the earth, we'll take care of heaven. Now, that's a little bit caricaturing, but basically that's the deal we made with Constantine. We won't really have a conflict. You have the soldiers, we have the angels. And thank you for the church.
Michael, what has to change in the church, in your opinion?
I think from the perspective of just ordinary people, who are the people who are marginalized, exploited, often rendered powerless. I think what has to change is their recognition that that God is calling them to be protagonist in the ongoing unfolding of God's reign on earth in the here and now. Theology, bad theology, has promoted a perception that heaven is on the other side of this life and that people have to endure suffering and pain and exploitation throughout this entire life that they get to live, when in fact, heaven is possible in the here and now. But that God is waiting for us to be co-creators along with God and with others in building God's reign in this present moment. That is a fundamental shift. It's a shift in consciousness. It's a
Hmm.
shift from thinking from a framework of thinking that is tied up in bondage and death and acceptance and apathy over the conditions that we face today to a dramatic shift in consciousness to one in recognizing that God is a liberating God. God is a God of justice. God is a God of mercy. God is a God of compassion. and that God wants for us now, not 2,000 years from now, justice and love and compassion and righteousness. And that we have to be the ones to work with one another and with God to create that world. And it's going to be hard and it's going to be messy and it's going to be difficult, but that we have to be the ones to do it. That's a dramatic shift in consciousness for an overwhelming number of people in our church.
And Dom, can you add to that theologically?
No, not very much. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the whole thing. Let's talk about heaven. That's the thing. We're getting ready for heaven. If that's what's going on, then we lose the earth. That's what Michael said, and I agree with it completely. The church is gradually becoming, I'm not going to say extinct. I was at Samaritan Passover on Mount Gerizim way back in the late 60s. I could see how people can hang on, but you aren't relevant and you aren't touching the world. You're at best entertainment, maybe.
One of the problems I think you guys have been talking about, not only in this book, but just in this section now too, is the fact that, our theology has gone from, well, it's going to be happening later, right?
Yeah.
Anything that
Yeah.
happens now, anything that happens today doesn't really matter because my home is in heaven and my riches are there and all that stuff, and everything's going to happen later. And that's, according to Mark, that's not what Jesus preached. Um, and one last thing, for both of you here, what do you think has to happen in our faith, um, to show up publicly?
Well, I'm going to go first because I really want Michael to go last on this one. Um, I can only say my own experience, all right?
Yeah.
I've spent my life basically working in the first century in all its environments. The way I do it is by reading everything I can and by visiting all the sites I can. I was all over the place. I was all over Iran, by the way, in the 1960s, all over the country. And I want to say this, I'm getting distracted now. You can have a magnificent people led by a very bad government. That's true of Iran at the moment. It's also true of America.
Right.
Let me say that loudly and clearly. So I hope that can change. Otherwise, I don't know where our future is.
And Michael?
I would say two things. One is in the book, we talked about this distinction, and it's not to diminish in any way the, uh, the people who genuinely feel a deep sense of calling to worship Jesus. But there is a distinction between worshiping Jesus and following Jesus. This is a distinction that many brilliant religious thinkers from Richard Rohr and Howard Thurman and many others have articulated. But there is an important distinction here. If you are worshiping Jesus, but you're not following Jesus, you're missing the heart of the gospel and Jesus's message of justice. Following Jesus's path is a very difficult path, but it is essential to authentic discipleship. And that is critically important. Far too many people worship Jesus without following the difficult path that Jesus articulated and modeled for us. The other thing I would say that's important to that is understanding what is the message that Jesus conveyed about this reign of God movement. I think a big part of that challenge is escaping a theological framework that is grounded in our dominant cultural realities. So much of Christianity today is infused with patriotism, American exceptionalism, this dedication and obsession with gun ownership, with violence, with imperialism. Theology and Christian nationalism that's so infused with our dominant cultural narratives and habits, it's no longer Christianity. It's just a packaging of Christian symbols with the dominant symbols of the day, or the dominant trends, or the dominant commitments, such as our commitment to unfettered capitalism, or gun ownership, or patriotism, or whiteness, whatever it may be. We've any authentic commitment to following Jesus, we've got to escape from the clutches that our dominant culture has over Christianity, and recognize the heart of the gospel, which is fundamentally about justice and mercy and compassion, and this reign of God movement, which was deeply anti-imperialistic. That if we don't have that understanding of Jesus's message, and if our understanding of Christianity and the walk that Jesus walked, it's difficult to understand what we are meant to do and are supposed to do as Christians in the world today if we're locked in a mindset of the dominant culture. And that is a challenge for Christians, is to escape from that dominant cultural mindset and framework.
Well, I keep coming back to this. The question isn't whether Jesus cared about justice. The question is whether or not we're willing to organize our lives around it. And that's really
Mhm.
where it comes down to. So, because the reign of God isn't something that we just believe, it's something that we should practice together. So, on our way out, Michael, why don't you give us some information about how we can get a hold of you and things like that?
Sure. The website I would recommend visiting is the website for the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership. If anyone goes to www.csplaction.org, you'll find us. There you'll learn a lot about our work, and then you could also visit our YouTube page, CSPL Action, and that's the same handle for any of our social medias. We have got a lot of information and content on the website, on YouTube, and in other social media spaces. So that would be my number one recommendation.
Thank you, Michael, so much. Dom, again, as always, thank you so much for showing up. I have always appreciated what you've done for me in this podcast. So the book was great. I enjoy listening to you as much as I can. I see you on Tripp's podcast quite a bit. So I listen to that pretty religiously. So thank you again for showing up. And is there anything else either one of you would like to say before we get out of here?
I only say one thing to give the last word to Jesus, if you will, unless Michael wants to say it. What Michael has just been saying, Jesus said too, why do you say, Lord, Lord? That's worship me. Lord is what you say to Caesar. Why do you say, Lord, Lord, but won't do what I say? So already, I don't think, no, if Jesus ever said that, but Michael said, it's not Michael, sorry, Matthew says it. So by the end of the first century, Matthew at least was aware that there were people saying, Lord, 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 but ain't doing it. So worshiping, but not following, not imitating. Much easier, by the way.
It sure is. So thank you guys very much. And we will see you guys later.
All right.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis, very much.